Hi everyone, it's QuickyBaby and welcome back to World of Tanks, and today I've got a full tank review for you of a brand new Tier 8 premium British heavy tank. It is the Charlemagne. This vehicle specialises with a 120mm main armament that deals 440 damage per shot, but unlike vehicles like the Defender, this thing also has a whopping amount of gun depression of 10 degrees, which might allow you to work a ridgeline very well. Oh, it definitely will. There's no doubt about that if you've got 10 degrees. Combine this with reasonable amounts of mobility and some really troll angled side armor, and yeah, you might have a very hot package here. So, the Charlemagne, how are you able to get your hands on this? Well, unfortunately, it's going to be one of those vehicles that you're going to have to get through at least till, I believe, Division 2 in the upcoming ranked season. And then it's going to have a whopping price tag of 15,000 bonds. And when the Concept 1B is also going into the bond shop, which I will talk about in a separate video this week, and the fact that you can get vehicles like the AMX M445 and the Patriot for much lower than that, this one's going to have to be good if it's going to be worth the price. So while there are so many vehicles at Tier 8 that you would want to compare the Charlemagne to, I'm going to try and narrow it down to the Carnarvon Action 10, which is a direct competitor as a Tier 8 premium British heavy tank, and also the latest premium heavy tank in the game, the Skoda T56, because that one is also very hard hitting. Immediately we notice that the damage per minute of the Charlemagne is thoroughly disappointing at 1,580, and unlike the Skoda T56, which has really good damage per minute, it doesn't have an autoloader. This means that while this 119.38mm caliber gun has an impressive 440 alpha damage, it has a very long reload time of 16.7. And when you consider that the Skoda T56 just went into the game with 460 alpha damage, and the fact that it reloads an entire magazine of 2 rounds in 25 seconds, and then it can deliver a 2-round 920 alpha damage burst in 3.5 seconds of the first shot, yeah, the Charlemagne does look a little bit limp in comparison. However, not having an autoloader can still be an advantage when you only want to fire one shot and then reload, unlike the Skoda T56, where you really will be behind the Charlemagne if you just want to fire one and then reload the entire magazine. And unlike the Skoda T56's disappointing 248mm of premium penetration, the Charlemagne gets an impressive 270. One thing that I'd like to mention about this vehicle is that its gun is literally called a 120mm low velocity gun. And when we go and take a look at the shell velocity of the different rounds that this vehicle has, yeah, it's really not lying. The standard rounds on this tank have 597 meters a second shell velocity, making this the worst on any high tier vehicle, except for using a derp gun on the Japanese Oho. Now, when you load gold with this vehicle, the shell velocity actually goes up by over 50%, up to a much more manageable 924. And I actually found myself at times making sure that I loaded gold in this vehicle even when I didn't need the penetration, just to be able to have it at long range, which kind of defeats the purpose of playing a tier 8 premium tank, to try and make credits, right? One thing that is bizarre about the Charlemagne is that it seems to have enough room inside the vehicle to carry enough ammunition to last multiple battles. So unlike the Skoda T56, you're probably not even going to need 2 loadouts using the new field modifications feature for your good and your bad matchups, because you could pretty much just take 20 rounds of every ammo type in this vehicle, and it's very unlikely that you're going to run out, even if you're firing non-stop. So now we're going to move on to the gun handling, and this is where it's some absolute bizarre ups and downs for the Charlemagne. And that is because it has pretty much worst in class aim time at 3.5 seconds. I could go back 10 years in World of Tanks, and not many vehicles have aim time that is that bad. And considering that this vehicle doesn't have a, should we say, outrageous amount of alpha damage, seeing how the Skoda T56 is in the game now, seems like it's a lot. On top of that, the accuracy at 0.44, Wargaming really don't want you to snipe in the Charlemagne, that's for certain. However, this is where things get bizarre. The dispersion when moving and when turning the turret are actually really good. In fact, the dispersion when turning the turret is twice as good as the Carnarvon Action 10, and the dispersion is better while moving. That means that this vehicle can probably go without vertical stabilizers and invest an extra equipment slot elsewhere. What you should choose, I'll talk about more in a second. The gun depression on this vehicle is also great at 10 degrees, a lot like on the Carnarvon Action 10. And this is just such a bizarre roller coaster ride for the Charlemagne. Some of its statistics are amazing. Some of its statistics are absolutely awful. This eccentric British nature seems to be coming out with this new Tier 8 premium British tank. So how about the mobility with the Charlemagne? Well, this vehicle goes forwards at 35 and backwards at 15. It's fairly standard for a Tier 8 heavy, making it a little bit slower forwards than the Carnarvon Action 10, but significantly faster backwards. In fact, it's very comparable to the Skoda T56 until you look at the power to weight ratio. And that is because this vehicle gets a healthy power to weight ratio of 16.67. And that's because the vehicle is actually fairly light at 45 tons for a heavy tank, unlike the Carnarvon, which is packing 65. And so all of you high-tier heavies, and even some of you high-tier mediums, if you see a Charlemagne, don't be afraid to ram it because you're quite likely to come off on top. What this means is that while the Charlemagne has a limited top speed limit, that it never has a trouble getting there. And so it kind of makes the Charlemagne feel a bit like the old Centurion before it had its top speed limit buffed up to 50. It's quite good in a brawling situation. You have enough grunt in the engine to be able to get up a slope irrelevant of how steep it is, and you can manage, outside of the poor traverse speed that the vehicle has, to be able to outmaneuver slower and more cumbersome tank destroyers and heavy tanks, for example. Be warned, however, because the vehicle's tank traverse at 26, that's definitely something that you're going to want to try and improve, either with equipment, if you want to try and make use of the great power to weight ratio that this vehicle has. So now onto the armor of the Charlemagne, and it has 130 at the front and 70 at the side. That's comparable to the Carnarvon Action 10, but nobody really likes the armor on the Carnarvon Action 10. But it does trump the Skoda T56 from the front and is comparable from the side. The turret armor on this vehicle, though, looks really disappointing compared to the other two tanks. 170 on the turret front, 80 on the side. But really, we have to go and take a look at the armor model to get a real idea of how it all pans out. Here we see that from a distance, the Charlemagne, with its very well-angled frontal pike nose, actually has decent protection. 226 millimeters of effective armor over the front. That means that you're not even going to have to angle against Tier 6 and Tier 7 tanks. And even Tier 8s, unless they load gold, are going to have a 50% chance or less to be able to go through the front of your vehicle. If you angle the side of this tank, as we can see, it's very well angled on the side, so you can actually over-angle it before they're going to be able to penetrate you. So I've often used this vehicle in my fairly short, but I'd still say extensive play session with this vehicle to bait people into shooting my side armor, and you can even over-angle it up until this point and really bait some Muppets into ricocheting off you. But be warned, it's not going to work against high explosive anti-tank rounds if you angle your armor that much. Now let's talk about the hull armor, the turret armor of this tank. We can see that it does have a weak point on top, 80 millimeters of effective armor, and it feels like it's fairly flat if your enemies are above you, so be warned, everybody's going to be going through that. Turret armor wise, the forehead of the vehicle isn't going to do very well against high explosive anti-tank rounds, but it'll do well against armor piercing rounds. And to the left and to the right of the gun, this is where one of the tanks does have its weak points. However, this vehicle, with its 10 degrees of gun depression and mobility to be able to get there, clearly wants to try and use it. And if we manage to get the vehicle like this, it is bouncing everything apart from, I guess, your heat rounds off the front of this vehicle when it's angling like this. And its turret armor now hides that weak point, and its turret is very effective indeed, and it should be able to handle most kinds of tanks. But be warned that even when you're using your 10 degrees of gun depression, you never quite get to the magic 70 degrees of armor angling on the front, so high penetration armor piercing rounds will still be able to go through you if you can see your opponents. To go along with this armor, it's got 1,500 hit points, very standard for a Tier 8 heavy, and 380 meters view range. It's not awful, but it's definitely not great. And so this means that unless you have an extremely skilled crew, probably from your Conqueror, and you're using vents on this tank and a premium consumable, your view range is never going to really get up to a healthy amount. And for people who want to be able to spot, to be able to snipe, thinking about it, do you really want to be sniping in this tank? And you're going to have to use coated optics, but I thoroughly wouldn't recommend that. But instead of just telling you what I would and wouldn't recommend, well, that's exactly what I should be doing in a tank review, right? Okay, so I think that this vehicle is actually quite complicated with what kind of equipment you should put on it. Firstly, before I talk about the equipment, let me say that if you have a Super Conqueror crew, your Super Conqueror crew will work perfectly inside this vehicle, as it does have a 4-crew loadout, with your loader being the radio operator, so hopefully you can have situational awareness there, and your commander actually having not too much pressure on them, so you don't even really need to have the commander as a premium crew member, but there is actually quite a lot of pressure on a loader now, considering that I do like to have intuition to be able to change shells. Equipment-wise on this tank, one thing that I would recommend for all players is vents. I feel like it just makes everything about this vehicle better, and they will go in the durability slot to be able to give yourself 6% overall cruise skill. I personally am going to use a gun rammer on this tank, even though it doesn't have very good damage per minute. In fact, it's got really bad damage per minute. I think you want to try and bump that up as much as you can, because you can't use, for example, an autoloader to try and control the engagement. And I think with heavies, they're not like mediums where you have the mobility to be able to get away from people, and sometimes you just have to get as many shells out of the vehicle as you possibly can. The third piece of equipment that I would recommend is actually a turbo on this vehicle. I know, QuickyBaby, why you recommend turbo so much? Well, that's because this tank, remember, actually has really good gun handling. And so I don't feel with this large caliber gun that you want to fight at close quarters combat on ridge lines and just when you're side scraping round corners, that you really need vertical stabilizers to be able to improve this. On a Carnarvon Action 10, it's mandatory to have vertical stabilizers because you've got a great rate of fire and you really have to get those rounds out quickly. With the Charlemagne having much better dispersion values and a much higher alpha damage, then I really feel that you would invest better into something that would increase the vehicle's limited top speed, but not limited power to weight ratio, to make you not a slow heavy, but instead either a slower medium or one of the faster heavy tanks. Keep in mind though that if you do set your vehicle up this way, unless you have an incredibly skilled crew and a premium consumable and you're using something like Bond Fence, you're only going to have 442 meters view range. And if you end up getting the tank and hate the gun handling, then drop the turbo out for vertical stabilizers and you'll have a very standard setup. Anyway, I think that's quite enough talking. Let's take the Charlemagne out onto the battlefield. All right, let's roll out in Tier 8 matchmaking. And I'm sure that some of you in the comments are going to be asking, what is that commander voice? Well, that is the Cobra commander that was from some kind of Twitch Prime package. And I think it's quite fetching. It's always quite fun when you're the Brits to be the bad guys, right? Okay, so at the start of the game, check out the Charlemagne's mobility. And remember that I am using a turbo on this tank, which will increase its top speed limit by 4 kilometers an hour forwards. Now, if I manage to eventually get this vehicle and I buy the field mods, then I will be able to put it inside a mobility slot in this tank and I'll be able to have a 40 kilometer an hour top speed limit. But you can see that we're getting to places fairly quickly, even though we've got a bad spawn. And one thing I'd like to clarify here is the Basante on my team asked if I was a CC, standing for a community contributor. And I foolishly decide that I'm going to answer said player. Look at what QuickyBaby will say. QuickyBaby will typing away while my reticle goes up to the sky. Yeah, QB, check review tonight. And then I realize, oh, I'm in a terrible position. Well, I think we just found out that nice guys finished last. Well, I say, my HP. Oh, I'm just role-playing, right? I'm role-playing British. Oh, my HP, oh boy, what even happened to that? Well, look, I just wanted to really show you what this vehicle would be all about, even if we had to play it hard mode. Starting the game with 1/3 of our allotted 1,500 hit points. So in this situation, the Charlemagne is just absolutely ridiculous for trading. Having that 440 alpha damage and yet having 10 degrees of gun depression allows you to work ridge lines like other team tanks, or teams even, can only dream of. This thing, with that all-round ridgeline control and the alpha damage to be able to trade evenly with an autoloader or even out-trade the autoloader one by one. Whenever I managed to get this thing on a ridgeline, it did feel god tier. I actually managed to have better games than the one that you're going to see now in the short-ish playtime that I had with the vehicle against lower-tiered tanks. And I can tell you, this thing does really nasty things to lower-tier tanks, because your 220 millimeters of penetration on your standard rounds is more than enough to be able to deal with them. And I'd just like to highlight, did you see how slow that shell was? you might be noticing that 597 meters a second shell velocity when we're firing in close quarters combat. But just look at it now. Pew! Yeah. It does feel a lot more like a derp gun on this tank. So watch out for that if you decide to spend the bonds on this thing, because it can be very painful at decent distances to try and be able to snipe and be able to give lead. And obviously you can have good lead and good skills at being able to aim and to be able to give that extra lead, but it also gives the enemy more of a chance to be able to change their maneuvers. So even if you're an incredibly knowledgeable player when it comes to giving lead in World of Tanks and being able to judge how far that vehicle is away and how many extra seconds you're going to have to judge to be able to get the enemy vehicle, there's no doubt that poor shell velocity in World of Tanks is just worse. If you could have a shell that instantly arrived at the enemy tank before you, while you fired out your gun, you wouldn't have to give any lead at all. That would be so amazingly good. And you can kind of get that in World of Tanks in vehicles like the K91 with its 1,700 meters a second shell velocity. The Charlemagne, on the other hand, yeah, its shell is 3 times slower than that of the tier 10 Soviet heavy tankers, so you have to give good lead. And you see that I'm actually starting to panic a little bit there with the shot, and even though I had the right lead on the shell, because the Pantera went down the dip, because I had to give so much lead, I'm unable to be able to hit the tank. It is rather frustrating on this. But one thing that isn't frustrating is just having those 10 degrees of gun depression and that big old 440 damage shell. It just feels absolutely meaty on the Charlemagne. Alright, so the Pantera unfortunately managed to put 1 shell into us, meaning that now they can kill us with a subsequent 2 shells unless they have the mother of all high rolls, which is actually possible, but hopefully that's not going to be the case. So in this situation, I'm just going to sit above the Pantera. They fire 1 shell at us. I guess they hit our sidearm. I put my gun up a little bit to try and protect my weak point, just hoping that they're going to be able to bounce the shells. And yeah, they do. They just bounce a couple of rounds. Are they going to fire the extra one? Nope, doesn't look like it. And we plow over the ridge and put 450 damage into them. And that is really all we need to do with regards to bullying tanks. This thing does feel, with the turbo, that it's just its acceleration up slopes. It doesn't seem to lose that speed. You see that I'm actually reloading a gold round here because I thought I was going to have to give lead. I think that was the most unnecessary gold round that I've pretty much fired in this entire game. But did you see, I actually went towards the target significantly faster. I really did notice when I was shooting at long range, and I found myself loading a little bit more gold in this tank at certain times than I otherwise probably would want to, and maybe even would need to. But the possibility of bouncing 440 could be so frustrating. So in this scenario, I'm going to load a gold shell and try and fire it through the Emil's turret, but then I realized, why don't I just overmatch his side armor? Job done. Unnecessary gold round there. I could have fired a regular round. And unfortunately for me, the Emil on the enemy team returned the favor with the gold. And I guess because I'm wedging the back of my tank slightly up the slope, that means they can pen the top of my turret, which, as I said, it's not particularly wonderful on this vehicle. All right, so round 2 for the Charlemagne. Let's see how it will deal with not just its own tier, but also higher tier tanks. Just like to say how small this vehicle is for a heavy tank. Look at it compared to the IS-3-2 behind me. It's actually quite low profile, and that can allow you to hide yourself on a ridgeline even better. So we're going to put it round it to start the game off with into the T-55A, and I should say thank you to that IS-3-2 for actually reversing. They kind of didn't need to there. Well, it would have been nice. I mean, they could have blocked me and it could have been an absolute disaster. So I'm going to be a little bit greedy here, and I'm going to come around the corner to be able to finish off the Somewhat SM. And I managed to take a hit from the VK, and I also take a hit from the T-55A. And you know what? I'm sorry, Cobra Commander. I'm having to mute him. I'm having to mute him, YouTube. I should have done that a while ago. Oh my lord. The Cobra Commander is quite fun when you're just there chilling and you get to listen to him. But when you've got to try and just hear him muttering on in the background, I got to silence that Cobra Commander. Oh no. I can already hear the YouTube comments being written of the rage that I have silenced the hero for many people who used to love G.I. Joe, right? Hoping that Cobra Commander would be able to beat Joe, right? Or Duke. was Duke, right? It was G.I. Joe, but I believe that Duke was the hero, the protagonist. I don't know. Let me know in the comments down below so I can learn about the rich history of G.I. Joe. Look, back on track, and that is that in our Charlemagne, we've already picked up 1,000 damage and picked up a couple of kills. There's two things that I love about this tank. Oh, there's a few things. One, the alpha damage feels lovely. I really enjoy having 440 alpha damage, and it just seems that I print it way faster than in a Carnarvon Action 10, which has way better damage per minute in this vehicle. The other thing that I love is the gun depression just allowing me to work the ridge. But the main thing that I love about this vehicle has to be that decent mobility. I just felt that I had enough grunt in the engine to be able to get up into position quickly and to be able to fall back from position quickly. And it allowed me to be able to make more aggressive plays. The kind of size of this tank, it feels a bit like a Carnarvon, but don't expect it to have Carnarvon-like turret armor. That's definitely not going to be the case, unless I guess you're in a tier 6 or a tier 7 matchup. Alright, so in this scenario, it's all about just popping back, trying to get some cheeky shots in, while also trying not to get caught. And in this situation, having the great reverse speed that this tank has is wonderful. But this review would not be fair if I didn't also show you the terrible things about the tank, and that is that our hull armor just didn't work there. The WT Panzer IV puts a big old shell right through the upper hull, even though I was using some of my gun depression, and my inaccurate gun misses the WT Panzer IV. Look at that shot as well, just right over the WT Panzer IV. And while you've seen so far in the video me being dominant on a ridgeline in short, close-range combat, hopefully I was able to show you there just how bad this vehicle is for those kind of mid to long-range engagements. But now that there isn't artillery in the game, and now that there isn't so much high explosive rounds, or there are as many, but they're just not as effective, I do feel that these close quarters engagements in World of Tanks are becoming so much more important these days. Meaning that the Charlemagne, at least for me in the time that I've had with the tank, did feel as if it was quite meta. Now, the problem with this, I guess a lot of people are going to be asking now, do I think that this vehicle is absolute? Look how much lead we have to give against the Boras there, by the way, even at that short distance with the terrible shell velocity this tank has. I'm sure a lot of people are interested now as to whether I think that the Charlemagne is good compared to a lot of the other tanks that have gone into the game. Well, the Skoda T56 is an outrageously good premium tank, but it doesn't have the gun depression that this vehicle has, and it doesn't have the grunt in the engine that this vehicle has. Now, you can kind of make up for it on that vehicle, because of course you can't use a gun rammer, so you're probably taking a turbo vents and also vertical stabilizers to try and make the vehicle better able to deliver those double taps. This vehicle just seems to be so much more consistent for me by having those single shot guns. It's less bursty. I found that when I was playing the Skoda T56, I had games that were just absolutely wild, and I had games that were a little bit disappointing, or at least games where I didn't have fun because I didn't feel engaged. Another thing that this vehicle does so much better than the Skoda T56 will be the penetration. Look, it's not god tier. 220 on your standard rounds and 270 on your gold rounds is not exactly exceptional for World of Tanks. But I won't lie, well, I'm not lying when I suggest that this vehicle, with that penetration, just feels that it can be so much more consistent and have to load a lot less gold in situations compared to some of the vehicles that have lower penetrations but have other wild statistics. The Charlemagne is just an absolute freak in World of Tanks. It really is. This, for example, is a great situation for the tank, where I can use that 270 pen to reliably go through the lower hull of the T95. And in this situation, the mobility of this tank, I think, makes it way better than a Skoda T56 for this kind of a scenario. All right, the T95 has fired above us, so what we're going to do is move in. We're going to use the great gun handling on the move, and we've got the grunt in the engine to be able to outmaneuver the T95, get behind him, and job done, right? Stay behind him. And this is where you really want to be. Now, I do make a bit of a misplay here. I should have reloaded a regular round to be able to save some credits. But this is just, look how small this tank is for a heavy. It's just this absolute freak, it really is. It's like a compact tank that seems to just be able to have so many best-in-class statistics in some areas, but also so many worst-in-class statistics in other areas. You know me, I like my bizarre vehicles in World of Tanks. So this one, well, I'd like to say it's going to become one of my favorites. I just don't think that's the case. I think the vehicle's also got so many frustrating things about it with regards to the shell velocity, with regards to the fact that the armor, while it can work, it's never something that you can truly feel safe using. I do love the side armor on this vehicle. I like it against lower tier tanks. I like the fact that it has mobility and penetration inside those worst kind of matchups to be able to deal with tanks like the T-95 in this scenario. But there's just too many things about this tank that means that it's more of a specialist tank than it is something that I would recommend to everyone. I personally think that the majority of players will probably end up doing better with a Carnarvon Action 10 because you've got better damage per minute in that vehicle, and the turret armor just feels more consistent, and the hull armor, it's just kind of like hide your lower plate and then you're okay. With this vehicle, you have to know a lot about your enemy's capabilities, all of their penetration values, to know what kind of different parts of your tank that you're able to expose. And it will also require a good amount of knowledge with this well-angled side armor, as we can see all the way along the vehicle here, to be able to bait your opponents into shooting you and then reacting to the situation as to what kind of ammunition they're using, whether they're using armor piercing or heat, to still remain effective. I think this gun is kind of like a wild horse. You're going to have to tame it. And while some horses are just not really tameable, this one I think you can manage to make work. But again, I think certain riders are probably going to struggle with this gun and find it just annoying the hell out of them with that awful .44 accuracy and the horrendous aim time of 3.5 seconds. With other players out there who know about the dispersion values of the vehicle, when you're moving and when you're turning the turret and you make your movements very precise, you're probably going to be able to make it work, especially at short range combat. And again, that's where I think the meta is going in World of Tanks right now. It feels like there's less sniping and more use your speed to be able to get into position and grind the players out, clustering up in positions like we saw earlier over here on the scenario where we had about 3 or 4 tanks sitting here, and previously that just wasn't the case. Tanks wouldn't go there because of artillery. One tank would sit there and then end up just camping. Now, because of the lack of artillery, it does feel as if the game is going much more close quarters combat, and gun depression is very much meta. You only have to see that because of the Kranvang that people will be playing ranked, I guess, to be able to try and get towards this vehicle. One thing that I'd like to mention about this vehicle is because of the high alpha damage, it doesn't really feel too demoralizing to fire gold rounds in it. The gold rounds on this tank cost 4,800 credits, and if you're penetrating, considering the vehicle gets a full premium status, even if you are spending quite a lot on ammunition, like I did in my second game, I was making tons of credits in every single game that I played in this vehicle. In our first round on Serene Coast, we get 1,404 base experience with 3,900 damage dealt, and that's after starting with only 500 hit points. The profit that we made if we take away the fact that I was using personal reserves would have been a healthy 80 or 90,000 credits. In the second game on Mannerheim Line, aka Arctic region, where we were fighting against tier 9 vehicles, we got 1,555 base experience for our 4,200 damage and killing a third of the enemy team. And if we take away the personal reserves and the premium consumables, we would have still made a good 70,000 credits profit even after firing gold unnecessarily at the back of the T-95. So all in all, the Charlemagne. So if this vehicle was just going into the premium store, would I recommend it if you had to purchase it with money? It's a tough one. For some people, yes. For some people, no. It's definitely not a bad premium tank, but is it going to be the best premium tank for everyone? Certainly not. It's very interesting that Wargaming are putting this into the new season of ranked battles that is going to be starting on Monday as a reward. No, actually, as just something that you're going to have to purchase. The price is 15,000 bonds, considering that you have to get to the 2nd division to be able to have the privilege of spending those bonds. That is a very steep price tag. I would personally recommend saving up just a little bit more and buying the Kampfpanzer 50T or the Concept 1B instead if you don't already have those tanks. And what I really think that Wargaming are just doing is creating more ways to force you to spend your bonds to try and get you to play the game. And frankly, they're putting in all right, but definitely not super special premium tanks knowing full well that the vast majority of players who play ranked have already got premium tanks, that then they're going to have to spend their bonds that they've grinded to be able to purchase the tank because they want to be a tank collector inside the game and have things as they go along. The result is that I think the Charlemagne is going to be a little bit of a meme of a vehicle in every regard. I really don't think that many players will end up purchasing it, and of the players who do, I don't really see them probably ending up playing it that much, but probably just having it in their garage so they can bring it out occasionally when they're feeling a little bit fruity. Nevertheless, there's one thing that the Charlemagne certainly is, and that is suitably eccentric for a British tank. It has some of the worst things about it, and yet also some of the best things about it as well. And because of that, I think this vehicle is definitely one that I'll be taking out a few times, at least every once in a while. It's not going to be my main tank, however. Anyway, ladies and gents, boys and girls, that's it for today. Really hope you enjoyed this tank review. If it was just useful for you, make sure you give the video a thumbs up. But if you hated it, give it a thumbs down. And let me know what you think about the Charlemagne, especially with regards to the fact that it's going to require you to play ranked to be able to purchase, and the fact that it costs 15,000 bonds. Is this one that you think you're going to skip out on, or is it something you're really looking forward to playing? And as always, thank you so much for watching. You've been epic, and hopefully I'll see you soon.